Right, so Peter Griffin. Of all the cartoon characters in all of television, he's probably not the one you'd expect to build a 2-hour video around at 1 in the morning. He's a fat, dim, loud American man who's been falling down staircases and fighting a giant chicken on Fox since 1999. He's not mysterious. He's not elegant. He doesn't have hidden depths in the obvious way that, say, BoJack Horseman has hidden depths. If you've watched even 10 minutes of Family Guy, you know exactly what Peter Griffin is on the surface. He's the joke. He's the punchline. He's the guy who fell down and held his knee for 30 seconds, while the laugh track tried to figure out what to do with itself. But that's the thing. He's been on television for over 25 years, and across all of that, a lot of very online people have stared at Peter Griffin for too long and started noticing patterns, contradictions, canonical facts that don't line up with other canonical facts. Episodes that only make sense if you squint at them sideways. And out of all that staring, an entire quiet little genre of fan theory has grown up around this one specific cartoon man. And most of it is, frankly, way darker than the show itself ever admits to being. So that's what we're doing tonight. We're going through every major Peter Griffin theory, one at a time, slowly, in no particular rush. Some of them are famous. The one about the mental institution is probably where we'll start, because even if you've never watched a full episode of Family Guy, you've likely seen that theory float past you on TikTok in the last couple of years. Some of them are less famous. Some of them contradict each other completely, and we're just going to sit with that contradiction rather than try to resolve it, because I think the contradictions are kind of the point with this show. Most of these come from Reddit originally. A lot of them come from TikTok. A couple of them are just things the show itself has actually established as canon that fans have quietly noticed and decided are way more interesting than the writers seem to realise. We'll take them as they come, in whatever order feels right. Quick housekeeping before we get into it. If you enjoy this kind of long-form ramble and you're not already subscribed, it helps more than you'd think. No pressure. Just putting it out there up front so I don't have to come back for it later and interrupt whatever mood we've built by then. All right, settle in, get comfortable. If you're already in bed, good, that's the point of a video like this. If you're reading along at your desk for some reason, that's also fine, no judgment here. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and none of it is urgent. That's sort of the promise of a video like this, isn't it? You don't have to be awake for the end. You don't have to remember what happens in section 4. The theories will still exist tomorrow, and Peter Griffin will still be on television, somewhere in the world, probably doing something stupid with a beer in his hand, regardless of whether you fell asleep before we got to him. One small note before we actually start. I'm going to be referring to most of these as theories even when the thing I'm describing is technically something the show has established as canonical, because the line between what's canon in Family Guy and what fans have speculated is honestly a complete mess. The show contradicts itself constantly. Peter's job changes. His heritage changes. How he met Lois has been retold about 6 different ways. So when I say theory, I'm using the word loosely. Sometimes it's a specific Reddit post that went viral. Sometimes it's something the show said in one episode and then quietly never mentioned again. Sometimes it's a bit of both. Let's just start, I think. Peter Griffin. What we know, what we don't, and what people on the internet have spent the better part of the last decade trying to figure out about a man who technically does not exist. We might as well start with the big one. If you've ever Googled Family Guy theories or scrolled TikTok for more than about an hour in late 2022, you've come across this one. It's the theory that ate every other Peter Griffin theory. Every time someone discovers the Family Guy fandom now, this is the first thing they're handed. It's the default. It's the one everyone means when they say, oh, there's a really dark Family Guy theory. The theory goes something like this. Everything we see on Family Guy, every episode, every adventure, every cutaway, every song Peter sings about the bird being the word, all of it is happening inside Peter Griffin's head. Not the Peter Griffin of the show, a real Peter Griffin, a man lying in a bed somewhere in a psychiatric facility in Rhode Island. lost inside a fantasy he constructed because the reality of his actual life was too much for his mind to carry. The origin of the theory, as far as anyone has been able to trace it, is a Reddit post on r/fantheories from around 2012 or 2013. The user was someone called u/b-0308. The post wasn't a viral sensation at the time. It sat on the subreddit, got a respectable number of upvotes, kicked around in Family Guy fan circles for years, and then, in late 2022, it caught fire on TikTok in that way certain internet artifacts do. Suddenly, teenagers who'd never watched Family Guy were telling each other to look up the theory and prepare to be disturbed. It went from quiet corner of Reddit to a thing your niece had heard about, which is about as mainstream as a fan theory can get. So, the premise. In the real world, according to the theory, Peter Griffin's life looks nothing like the show. His children are completely different people. Meg, who on the show is the universal punching bag of Quahog, is in reality beautiful. She's the most popular girl at her school. She's confident, she's well-liked, she's everything the animated Meg is not. Chris, in reality, has a serious cognitive disability. He didn't get enough oxygen when he was born, and it affected his development. He needs a fair amount of support to get through the day. He's gentle. He's easily overwhelmed. He depends on his family in a way most teenagers don't. One night, Meg takes Chris with her to a party. It's a standard teenage thing. She drinks too much. Chris is overstimulated by the crowd and the noise, and he has a panic attack. He needs to go home. Meg, who is already drunk and knows she shouldn't be anywhere near a car, makes the call to drive him back herself anyway. She's the only one who can. There's nobody else. They don't make it. The accident kills both of them. Lois, who is pregnant at the time with what would have become Stewie, cannot come back from the loss of 2 children at once. Her grief is absolute, and it doesn't recede. At some point during the pregnancy, Lois takes her own life. Peter is left standing in the rubble of everything. His daughter, his son, his wife, and the unborn child he was going to have. Gone in the space of days, one after another, for reasons that don't even line up into a coherent narrative. There's no villain. There's no act of God. It's just a teenage girl making one bad decision on one bad night, and a mother who couldn't survive what followed. And Peter's mind, faced with a loss at that scale, does what the theory argues any mind would do. It breaks, and in breaking, it builds a replacement, a better version. A version where his daughter is alive, even if she's unrecognizable. A version where his son is alive, even if he's a bit thick. A version where his wife is alive, even if she's always a little bit exasperated with him. A version where there's a baby, even if the baby is an evil genius with a British accent who keeps trying to kill his mother. A version where nobody stays dead. A version where every terrible thing that happens in one episode has been forgotten by the start of the next one. And that version, according to the theory, is Family Guy. I want to sit with how elegant that is for a second, because this is the thing that makes the theory spread the way it has. It's not just a reading, it's a reading that actually explains how the show works. Most fan theories tell you a secret about a character. This theory tells you a secret about the structure of the show itself, which is a much more satisfying thing to be told. Think about how Family Guy actually functions as television. Characters can be murdered on screen and be back for the next episode with no explanation. Peter survives traumas that should, by any reasonable physics, have killed him many times over. He gets shot, he gets hit by cars, he falls off buildings, he gets his face melted off once, and he's fine by the next Sunday. Time doesn't pass. Meg has been a high school junior since before some of her viewers were born. Stewie has been one for roughly the same length of time. Chris has been 15 since the Clinton administration. Under the institution theory, this is all explained in one clean move. None of it is real. It's the dream logic of a man who cannot let time pass because, if time passes, he has to confront that his family's gone. So time doesn't pass. Nobody ages, nobody dies, nobody even really changes much. The whole show is Peter's mind refusing to move forward, because moving forward means acknowledging what's actually happened. The bit that most people find genuinely unsettling, the bit that sells the theory for a lot of viewers, is the Meg part. Peter's treatment of Meg on the show is not just a running joke. It's sustained, specific cruelty that's gone on for decades. He ignores her. He insults her. He forgets she exists at family dinners. He once, in a memorable episode, literally bet her in a card game. Under the theory, this makes a horrible kind of sense. Meg is the one who was driving. Meg is the reason, in Peter's internal narrative, that his whole family is gone. Even inside the fantasy, where he's brought her back, he can't quite bring himself to forgive her. So the version of Meg he's built in his head is the version he can live with, resenting, unattractive, unloved, tolerated rather than embraced, permanently 16, and permanently a disappointment. It's not a great look when you put it like that. It's actually fairly horrifying. A man who has pulled his dead daughter back into his imagination only to punish her, there for the accident that killed them both. That's a grim little engine to find under the bonnet of a network sitcom that mostly runs on fart jokes and pop culture references. Stewie fits into this too, and fits in quite neatly. In the real world, under the theory, Stewie never got to be born. He died with Lois. Peter never got to meet him. So the version of Stewie he's built in his head is a fantasy of what that son could have been, which is to say, brilliant beyond measure. Not just a smart kid, a literal genius, a baby who can build time machines, a baby who speaks 4 languages, a baby who has, on more than one occasion, fought God. Because if Peter never got to know his son, he can at least imagine him as having been capable of anything. And then the other side of it, Stewie hates Lois. He's been trying to kill her across the entire run of the show. Under the theory, this is Peter's unprocessed anger at his wife for leaving him, projected onto the son he never got. Peter can't be angry at Lois directly, because he loves her, and she's gone, and that's too much to hold. So the anger comes out sideways, through a child who isn't real, in a fantasy that exists specifically to keep Peter from having to feel his actual feelings about any of it. Chris is the version of his son that Peter can still have a functional relationship with. So in the fantasy, Chris is a bit dim, but basically okay. He's not a genius like Stewie, and not beautiful like Meg. He's just there, present, loving his dad in an uncomplicated way, which is maybe the simplest version of grief, this one. Peter just wanted his son to be around, and so in the fantasy, his son is around. Lois gets the most tender treatment of anyone in the theory. She's patient with Peter. She's his anchor. She's there every night when he comes home. She puts up with his nonsense. The animated Lois has a lot of flaws, but she's the only Griffin who Peter reliably treats well, because under the theory, she's the one he misses most purely. No accident, no complication, no guilt. Just a woman he lost because she couldn't survive losing her kids, and a man who has built a whole universe to keep her talking to him. This is the version of the theory that's gone viral. This is the one that sat in the back of the Family Guy fandom for over a decade, and the one that has, honestly, come to define the show for a lot of casual viewers in a way the writers probably didn't intend, and almost certainly don't love. What I find interesting about it, personally, is that it doesn't require any of the weird lore gymnastics that most fan theories require. You don't have to squint. You don't have to know the name of some obscure episode from season 14. The theory just looks at the show as it is, asks why it behaves the way it does, and proposes one answer that explains almost everything. That's a rare quality in a fan theory. Most of them leave about 20% of the show unexplained and hand-wave the rest. This one tries to cover everything, and mostly succeeds. Whether it's true in any sense that matters to the writers, obviously, no. Seth MacFarlane is not secretly writing a deeply tragic portrait of a grieving widower. The show is a comedy. It was designed as a comedy. The inconsistencies have boring real-world explanations, which is that the show has been around for decades and multiple writing rooms have handled it. But fan theories aren't usually trying to be correct, they're trying to be interesting. And the mental institution theory is interesting because it takes a show most people treat as background noise and turns it into something you can't quite look away from once you've heard it, which is probably why it's spread. That's the headline theory then. It's the one everything else tonight is going to bump up against in one way or another, so I wanted to get it out early. The rest of the video is either going to reinforce parts of it, or argue with it, or quietly sit next to it doing its own thing. But it's the gravitational centre of Peter Griffin theorising, and there was no point pretending otherwise. Now, staying in the same neighbourhood for a moment, there's another theory that works a bit like a gentler version of this one. Same basic question, different answer. Worth talking about next, I think, while we're still in the right headspace for it. So imagine, for a moment, that nobody's dead. Imagine Peter's family is completely intact. Lois is upstairs. Meg and Chris are at school. Stewie is in his cot. Nothing tragic has happened. Peter is just, for lack of a better phrase, a bloke with some problems upstairs, living an ordinary lower middle class American life in Rhode Island. The heightened reality theory proposes that Family Guy isn't a grieving man's fantasy. It's closer to a documentary. We're watching Peter's actual life, but we're watching it filtered through his perception of it. And because Peter's perception is, to put it politely, a bit unreliable, everything we see on screen is how it feels to him, not how it actually is. So when Peter goes out to buy beer and ends up in a 40-minute fistfight with a giant anthropomorphic chicken that destroys half the town, what actually happened is that Peter got into a minor argument with someone at the shop, and it escalated in his head to epic proportions. When Peter says he's had 1,247 jobs over the course of the show, what's actually happened is that Peter can barely hold a job for 6 months at a time, and each job feels, to him, like an entirely new chapter of his life. When Peter remembers meeting Lois in a different way every third episode, it's because Peter's memory genuinely works like that, and he keeps reconstructing the story slightly differently every time he tells it. I quite like this one, honestly. It's got less gravitational weight than the institution theory, but it's more interesting to actually sit with, because it doesn't require anything tragic to have happened. It just requires you to accept that Peter Griffin is, at a neurological level, a bit broken, which, as we're about to get into in the next section, the show itself has explicitly told us he is. The theory tends to get attributed on Reddit and on WatchMojo lists to a general fan consensus rather than a single named originator, which is its own kind of interesting. It's the sort of theory that feels like it was in the air all along, and a lot of people arrived at it independently, just from watching enough of the show. You can find versions of it going back to fan forums in the mid-2000s, which is older than most Family Guy fan theories actually are. Here's what makes it work, I think. Family Guy, as a piece of television, does a specific thing that most sitcoms don't. It presents every moment of Peter's internal experience with exactly the same weight as his external experience. When Peter remembers a song from 1983, we see the full music video. When Peter imagines a scenario, we see the scenario happen on screen for about 30 seconds before snapping back. When Peter thinks about a celebrity he saw on television once, the celebrity literally walks into the room. On any other show, this would be bad filmmaking. It would be mixing reality and fantasy in a way that confused the viewer. On Family Guy, it's the core stylistic feature, and the heightened reality theory suggests this isn't a filmmaking choice, it's a character choice. We're seeing reality the way Peter experiences it, and Peter's experience is a constant bleeding together of what's actually happening, what he's remembering, what he's imagining, and what he saw on TV last Tuesday. That's actually quite a sophisticated thing for a cartoon to be doing, even accidentally. It's the kind of thing you'd expect from a prestige drama about a character with a dissociative disorder. Not from the show that gave us Peter turning into a chicken fight for the 9th time. And it means that the giant chicken, for example, is a real fight Peter keeps having with someone at the grocery store over something petty. The Kool-Aid man bursting through a wall mid-conversation is a real thing that happens in some version, except the real version is probably just that Peter got distracted. The road to episodes where Peter and his friends are somehow in ancient Rome or on a runaway train are probably real road trips that Peter is remembering with a lot of embellishment. The nice thing about this theory is that it doesn't require you to kill off the family to make it work. Everyone's still alive. The cruelty toward Meg isn't because she killed anyone in a drunk driving accident. It's because Peter genuinely does treat his daughter badly. And the show is just showing us that honestly, without softening it, because Peter doesn't perceive it as being particularly harsh in the moment. That's how casual cruelty actually works in real families. The person doing it doesn't usually think of themselves as being cruel. They think they're being funny. If you've ever been around someone whose perception of their own behaviour doesn't match up with everyone else's perception of their behaviour, you'll recognise something in this theory. Peter doesn't think he's a bad father. He thinks he's a fun dad. He thinks he's generally the hero of most of the rooms he walks into. The animation is showing us his internal state, and his internal state is consistently about 3 steps more confident and charming than his external state, which produces that very specific Family Guy discomfort, where you can tell Peter thinks he's being charming, but he's actually being a nightmare. There's a scene in Petarded, which we'll get to in more detail in a minute, where Peter has just found out he's below the legal threshold for being considered mentally competent, and he walks around town for a while just being aware of it. The show plays it for laughs, but it's one of the only times in the series where Peter seems to actually see himself from the outside. He realises he can get away with things because people assume he doesn't know what he's doing. It's a brief, quiet, genuinely interesting moment, and then the show forgets about it forever and goes back to the giant chicken. The heightened reality theory takes that one episode and says, right, that's the real Peter, the one walking around aware that he's a bit impaired. The rest of the show is the version he tells himself about himself, which is more flattering, more interesting, more heroic, and more consequential than the real version. I think what I like about it, if I'm being honest, is that it's the only Peter Griffin theory that doesn't require Peter to be some kind of tragic figure. The institution theory, as we've just talked about, requires him to have lost everything. Most of the other theories we're going to get to tonight require him to be secretly broken in one way or another. The heightened reality theory just says no, he's fine, he's just a bit of a mess. And the show is showing you what being a bit of a mess looks like from the inside. It's the most humane theory, is what I'm getting at. It treats Peter like a person having a normal amount of trouble navigating his own life, rather than like a walking tragedy who's the victim of cosmic forces. He's not grieving a dead family. He's not the centre of a multiverse. He's just a guy who sees the world in a slightly cartoonish, slightly embellished way, and the show is rendering that experience honestly, rather than cleaning it up into something more conventional. Now, you can obviously layer this theory on top of other theories if you want to. A lot of Reddit threads basically argue that both the institution theory and the heightened reality theory can be true at the same time. Peter is in an institution, lost in a fantasy, and inside the fantasy, his own perception is still unreliable. That's the sort of layered reading fans love, because it lets them have their cake and eat it too, and it means every contradiction in the show can be explained by at least one of the 2 theories. Personally, I don't think you need both. I think the heightened reality version is cleaner and more interesting, and the institution version is the one that spreads better because it's darker and more suited to TikTok. But people are going to layer them regardless of what I think. One thing that's worth saying about this theory before we move on, it has a slightly unsettling implication, which is that it suggests Lois and the kids are actually living with this version of Peter. Not a dream version, a real version, the one who brings home a donkey and thinks that's a reasonable evening. The one who forgets his daughter's name at dinner. The The one who disappears for 3 days because he remembered he owed someone a favour and had to go to Istanbul to resolve it. That's a real man, living in a real house, affecting his real family in real ways, and his real family is having to manage it every single day, forever, because Peter is not going to get better. He doesn't see any reason he should. From his perspective, he's having the time of his life, which is, when you sit with it, maybe actually the saddest version of Peter Griffin. Not the grieving one, not the institutionalized one, this one. The one who's fine. The one who's just gonna keep being himself in a house with 4 people who'd quite like him to calm down a bit, for as long as the show is on the air, which at this point looks like it might be forever. I'll be honest, I find this theory way more unsettling than the institution one. The institution theory has a clear cause, a clear trauma, a clear logic. This one is just a man being himself and everyone around him having to live with it. That feels closer to real life, which is, I suppose, why it's the heightened reality theory in the first place. Now, that bit I mentioned about Petardide, the episode where Peter finds out he's actually diagnosable, that's worth a whole section on its own, because it's one of the stranger things the show has ever established about Peter Griffin as a character, and then mostly forgotten about. Worth pulling apart. Season 4, Episode 6. Petarded. The setup is, on the face of it, a very normal Family Guy sitcom plot. The Griffins have their neighbours over for game night. They're playing Trivial Pursuit. Lois, wanting Peter to feel included, sneakily gives him the preschool edition cards, while everyone else plays with the adult questions. Peter wins. He has no idea he was playing a different game. He takes the victory extremely seriously and spends the rest of the evening being an unbearable git about how clever he is, lording it over the other adults in the room. Brian, who has never been able to leave any of Peter's behavioural spirals alone, decides he's had enough. He tells Peter that if he's really that intelligent, he should apply for a MacArthur grant. For those who don't know, the MacArthur grant, commonly called the Genius Grant, is a real thing. It's a $500,000 fellowship handed out every year to about 20 or 25 people in the United States who are considered to be doing exceptional creative work. You don't apply for it in the normal sense. You get nominated, but the show treats it as something Peter can apply for because it's Family Guy and nobody cares. So Peter applies. He takes what the episode frames as an evaluation. The results come back. Peter is, in the language the episode uses, intellectually impaired. He is below the threshold for being considered mentally competent to function as an independent adult. This isn't the show being mean. This isn't a joke about how Peter's a bit thick. This is a formal, in-universe diagnostic result delivered by a professional, and the show treats it as a real thing that really happened to the character. And then the episode goes on to explore it for about 15 minutes. Peter realises that he can get away with all sorts of inappropriate behaviour because people assume he doesn't know what he's doing. He starts exploiting this. He accidentally injures Lois. Child Protective Services gets involved. Cleveland ends up with custody of the Griffin children for a period. Peter nearly goes to prison. It's a whole plot. By the end of the episode, things have more or less reset, the family's back together, and the show moves on. And here's the thing. The show basically never comes back to this. Peter's canonical diagnosis is mentioned in passing occasionally over the years, but the implications of it, that he is legally not mentally competent to raise his own children, are almost entirely dropped. He keeps being Peter. He keeps having adventures. He keeps being treated on the show like a regular, if somewhat dim adult. The fact that he's been formally assessed as below the threshold for being considered competent becomes one of those things that's technically true in the universe of the show, but that the show has chosen to forget about because remembering it would make it hard to do the kind of comedy Family Guy does. The fan theory community, predictably, has not forgotten about it, and a lot of the darker readings of Peter Griffin are built on this one episode. Because if you take Petarded seriously as canon, rather than as a one-off joke the show played with, then almost everything Peter does on the show reads differently. The neglect of Meg, The casual cruelty toward Chris and Brian, the cutaway gags, the inability to hold a serious conversation for more than about 4 seconds before getting distracted, the pathological inability to learn from mistakes, no matter how many times those mistakes nearly kill him, the inability to stay employed, the inability to manage money, the tendency to form intense, consuming, emotional attachments to things like a Hollywood actor he saw on TV once, or a particular brand of beer, or a horse. These aren't character quirks, they're symptoms. The show told us this once in season 4, and then looked away from its own statements for the rest of the series. Now you can read this as a theorist and argue that it's actually the key to understanding every dark reading of Peter. Under this reading, Peter isn't a tragic widower in an institution, and he isn't a man with a heightened perception of reality. He's a person with a genuine, untreated cognitive impairment, being raised by an emotionally withholding stepfather, left mostly to his own devices, and eventually dumped into adult responsibilities he was never going to be able to handle. The show has actually given us breadcrumbs that support this beyond petarded. The biological father storyline, for instance. Peter's real dad is eventually revealed to be Mickey McFinnigan, an Irishman from a fictional village called McSwiggan, who is introduced to us as the town drunk. Mickey and Peter's first bonding moment is a drinking contest, which Peter wins and which is the first and only thing that makes Mickey accept Peter as his son. That's genetic texture. That's the show telling us Peter inherited a very specific set of predispositions from a man whose defining feature is that he can drink a superhuman amount of alcohol, and is, in the show's own words, the town drunk of a village where the bar is set extremely low. You combine that with Thelma, his mother, who is emotionally distant and has lied to Peter about basically every significant thing in his life. And you've got a kid who was set up from birth to struggle. His biological father was an alcoholic who wasn't in the picture. His stepfather hated him. His mother kept secrets. He was, as we're going to talk about properly in a later section, born in Mexico under circumstances that would normally be considered traumatic, and then smuggled across a border as a baby. None of that is a recipe for a stable adult. And when that adult then turns out to be, as Petarded confirmed, below the threshold for being considered cognitively competent, it starts to feel less like a joke and more like a diagnosis the show accidentally handed its own main character and then decided not to look at. What I find interesting about this theory, or this reading, or whatever you want to call it, is that it's one of the only ones on our list tonight that doesn't require speculation. It's just sitting there in the text. Season 4, Episode 6. Peter is mentally impaired. The show said it, the show knows. The show just doesn't want to engage with it, because doing so would make the comedy too uncomfortable. And I think that tension between what the show has said and what the show is willing to do with what it said is actually the engine of a lot of Family Guy fan theorising. Fans have noticed that the show told them something very specific about Peter once, and then walked away from it. They've spent years trying to fill in what the show refused to engage with. Most of the theories we're going to talk about tonight are, in one way or another, fans trying to complete a thought that the writers started and abandoned. There's something kind of melancholy about that if you sit with it. Family Guy is a show that has told us, in its own canon, that its main character is cognitively impaired, was raised by an abusive stepfather, was lied to by his mother about his origins, is biologically the son of a drunk, was technically born as the aftermath of an unwanted pregnancy, and is legally not competent to have custody of his own children. And then the show has spent 2.5 decades treating him as a lovable goofball whose main narrative function is to fall downstairs. There's a gap there between the text and the tone that a lot of fans have noticed, and a lot of the Peter Griffin theory ecosystem is just people trying to close that gap. One Reddit user I came across while reading up on this, whose name I can't remember specifically, but whose comments stuck with me, put it like this. They said, "Petarded is the only episode of Family Guy that has ever told the truth about Peter, and the show has spent the rest of its run trying to convince you that you didn't actually see what you saw, which honestly is as good a summary of this whole situation as anyone has produced. Now, there's a neighbouring canon fact worth touching on here, because it dovetails with the cognitive impairment reading in an interesting way. In Season 6, Episode 6, Padre de Familia, we find out that Peter was not born in the United States. He was born in Mexico. Thelma had travelled there while pregnant with Peter, intending to end the pregnancy, and then changed her mind at the last minute. She gave birth in Mexico. She then brought Peter back to the States as an infant without filing any immigration paperwork, meaning that Peter spent his entire life, to that point, as an undocumented immigrant without knowing it. The episode plays it for comedy, like everything on Family Guy, but the underlying facts are, taken on their own terms, pretty heavy. A woman travels to another country to end a pregnancy, changes her mind, gives birth alone, smuggles the resulting baby across an international border, and then raises him in a country where he has no legal standing, and also lies to him his entire life about being Irish-American when he's actually half Irish and born in Mexico, and also doesn't tell him that the man he grew up calling Dad isn't his biological father. That's a lot of foundational lies for one person to be sitting on top of, and we're going to come back to Thelma's whole body of deception in a later section, because she's a character who deserves more attention than the show has ever given her. But for now, the point is just that these canon facts stack: the petarded diagnosis, the Mexican birth, the unknown biological father, the emotionally unavailable stepfather, the lying mother. When you line them up, they form a profile of a person who was set up to fail long before he was ever old enough to do anything about it. And the show occasionally notices this. There are episodes scattered across the decades where Peter has moments of self-awareness that land differently once you know the context. Moments where he seems to briefly glimpse that his life isn't actually going well before the next cutaway gag arrives and saves him from having to think about it. Under the cognitive impairment reading, the cutaway gags aren't a writing choice, they're a mercy. They're the show protecting its own main character from realizations he's not equipped to process, which is honestly a kind of touching thing for a cartoon to be doing, if you read it that way. Anyway, that's the reading. Peter is, by the show's own admission, not quite neurotypical, and a lot of the show's strangeness falls into place once you accept that the writers once told us this directly and haven't quite been able to pretend they didn't. Now, there's a theory that tries to solve the same problem the institution theory solves, but from a completely different angle. Instead of saying the show is all happening in one man's head, it says there isn't really one man at all. There are infinite of him. Worth going into next, I think. This one's less famous than the institution theory, which is a bit of a shame because it's probably my favourite of the lot. The theory was originally posted, as far as anyone can tell, by a Reddit user who went by the name u/phase_poopy2, which is, let me be honest for a moment, not a name that inspires confidence. You see a username like that, and you assume whatever theory is about to follow is going to be nonsense. This is one of the small joys of Reddit as a cultural institution. Some of the most interesting fan theories of the last 15 years have come from people with usernames that a 12-year-old would roll their eyes at, the sacred and the profane, living side by side. Anyway, u/phase_poopy2 proposed a theory that goes like this: Peter Griffin isn't one man. Peter Griffin is a consciousness that exists across the entire multiverse, connected to every other version of himself in every other reality, and experiencing all of their lives simultaneously. When Peter references something in an episode that couldn't possibly have happened to him in any coherent timeline, it's because the Peter we're watching is drawing on the experiences of a different Peter from a different dimension. When the show contradicts itself about his heritage, or his job, or how he met Lois, or how old he is, or what his parents were like, It's because each episode is technically about a slightly different Peter in a slightly different Griffin household, and the consciousness watching over all of them is the same. And because the consciousness is shared, the Peter we're watching experiences every version of himself as his own memories. He doesn't distinguish between them. To him, meeting Lois at a party in 1985 and meeting Lois as her pool boy at her parents' estate and meeting Lois when they were both in kindergarten are all equally real, because in the multiverse, all of them are technically him. Whichever one he's in at any given moment is the canonical version for that moment, and the others get archived as slightly fuzzy memories that contradict it. This is, on the one hand, completely bonkers. On the other hand, it's the only theory we're going to talk about tonight that can cleanly explain every single inconsistency in Family Guy without having to squint. Which is more than you can say for a lot of fan theories. The show has actually given us textual support for this, if you're willing to accept it. Season 8 has an episode called Road to the Multiverse, which is a Brian and Stewie adventure that establishes definitively within the canon of Family Guy that the multiverse exists. There are infinite parallel dimensions. Stewie has built a remote that lets him travel between them. He and Brian visit dozens of alternate realities over the course of the episode, some of which have alternate Griffin families in them, and the episode doesn't present any of this as a weird one-off. It's just accepted from that point forward that the multiverse is a real part of the show's fiction, which means that if you want to argue Peter has some kind of multiversal consciousness, you're not arguing against the show. You're arguing with the show. The show has already confirmed the premise. You're just adding one small extra assumption on top of it, which is that one specific character has some awareness, conscious or unconscious, of his other selves. A different Redditor, going by u/Mike_B_Nimble, took this theory and extended it in a way I genuinely find charming. They argued that if Peter has this hive mind quality, maybe it's hereditary. Maybe his kids have it too. Maybe Stewie, specifically, is pulling from every other Stewie across the multiverse, which would explain why he is a toddler who can somehow build time machines, speak 4 languages, understand advanced physics, and run successful international criminal empires in his spare time. He's not a singular genius, he's a collective genius. Every Stewie in every dimension is sharing a brain, and the result is a kid who seems, in any one dimension, to know things he has no business knowing. That, honestly, is a lovely bit of extrapolation. It turns Stewie's absurd competence from a plot convenience into a consequence of the multiverse's basic architecture. And it quietly connects Peter and Stewie in a way the show has mostly kept at a distance, which is nice for a father-son pair who spend most of the series ignoring each other. The comparison to Rick and Morty is, I think, unavoidable here, and a lot of the Reddit discussion of this theory makes the comparison explicitly. Rick Sanchez is the obvious parallel. Rick is also a character who exists across infinite dimensions, who has a portal gun that lets him move between them, and whose personality is implicitly shaped by his awareness of all his other selves. Rick knows the multiverse is infinite. Rick has met other Ricks. Rick is who he is partly because he can never quite forget that he's not unique. Peter, on the other hand, has no idea any of this is going on. If the theory is correct, Peter experiences the multiverse passively. He doesn't know he's drawing on other Peters. He just experiences life as a series of events that don't quite line up and explains the gaps to himself as best he can, which is badly. That's incidentally a much more interesting version of the hive mind premise than Rick and Morty does. Rick is aware. Rick is the main character of his own multiverse situation. Peter is not aware. Peter is just the thing the multiverse is happening to, which puts Peter in a much stranger position as a character. Theoretically, he's an unknowing vessel for an infinite consciousness that's leaking out through him in ways he can't account for and wouldn't understand if he could. That's actually a kind of cosmic horror idea if you dress it up in better language. A man who keeps remembering things that didn't happen to him. A man whose past is never quite consistent from one telling to the next. A man who has the vague sense that he's lived several lives but can't quite place which one is his. If you stripped the cartoon out of it and gave it to someone like Philip K. Dick, you'd get a novel out of it. Family Guy is obviously not doing any of that on purpose. The show contradicts itself because it's an animated sitcom that's been around a long time and has had dozens of writers. The inconsistencies have a dead, boring, real-world explanation. But the multiverse theory is a much more fun explanation, and it has the advantage of actually being consistent with what the show has canonically established, which puts it ahead of most fan theories on that front alone. One thing I like about this theory, and I think it's why I've come to prefer it over the institution theory, is that it's basically the opposite of a tragedy. The institution theory asks you to believe that everything you're watching is actually happening inside a grieving man's broken mind. That's a heavy premise. It casts every joke in the show as a kind of coping mechanism. It makes the whole thing sad in a way that, frankly, the show doesn't earn, because the show isn't trying to be sad. The show is trying to make jokes about farts and celebrities. The multiverse theory doesn't ask you to find anything sad. It just says, look, the show's inconsistent, and that's fine, and here's a fun cosmological explanation for why. No one has to be dead. No one has to be in pain. Peter's life is just happening on an infinite scale in ways he doesn't understand, and the show is the imprint of that experience on his waking awareness. It's a more generous reading. It lets the show be what it is, which is a comedy, without having to build an elaborate tragic subtext underneath it. And I think, as fan theories go, that's a healthier approach to take with a show like Family Guy. Not every contradiction has to be trauma. Sometimes contradictions are just interesting on their own. Now, all of that said, there's one bit of this theory that's genuinely unsettling if you think about it for too long. And I'll leave it with you before we move on. If Peter is a hive mind consciousness connected to every other Peter, then what he's doing right now, falling off a roof, fighting a chicken, getting drunk at the Drunken Clam, is happening to billions of him at once. Every dumb decision, every broken bone, every moment of mild embarrassment at work, every regret, all of them everywhere, in every dimension, all at the same time. That is a lot of suffering for one consciousness to be experiencing. A lot of joy too, probably. A lot of everything. A lot of meaningless Tuesday afternoons in Quahog that are, technically, infinite Tuesday afternoons in infinite Quahogs. You kind of want to let him rest when you think about it like that. Anyway, the hive mind theory. It's fun, it's weird, it's slightly existential in a way that rewards thinking about at 1 a.m, and I think it's the cleanest solution to the show's continuity problems that fans have come up with. It doesn't require anyone to be dead. It just requires you to accept that Family Guy's cosmology is roughly as weird as it appears to be, which when you've watched enough of the show isn't actually much of a stretch. Now, shifting gears a bit, I want to talk about Peter as a father, because a lot of the Peter Griffin theory universe isn't actually about him personally. It's about his relationship to his children, and specifically whether those children are even his, which sounds like a bit of an abrupt left turn after what we just talked about. But stay with me, it's all connected in a very Family Guy sort of way. There's a Reddit user called u/MatildaLover128 who, a few years ago, put together one of the more ambitious Peter Griffin theories in the ecosystem. The proposal is simple. Peter Griffin is not the biological father of any of the 3 children he's raising. Not Meg, not Chris, not Stewie, none of them. 3 children, 0 genetic connection. Lois has been running a quiet decades-long enterprise of having other men's babies and passing them off as Peter's, and Peter has been raising them in cheerful ignorance for the entire run of the show. Now, to be clear up front, the show itself has largely disproven the Stewie part of this. There's a whole episode called Chap Stewie that confirms, more or less definitively, that Stewie is Peter's biological son. There's also the existence of Bertram, who we'll come back to in the next section, who is canonically Peter's biological son via sperm donation, and who looks quite similar to Stewie in several respects. So the theory, if you're being strict about the canon, falls apart at one of its three pillars. But the theory is still interesting, partly because it's built on things the show has actually said in episodes, and partly because the fact that this theory exists at all says something quite specific about how audiences have come to view Peter as a character. Let's take the pieces one at a time. Meg is the strongest leg of the theory, because the show itself has hinted at Meg not being Peter's biological daughter on multiple occasions. There's an episode in Season 3 called Screwed the Pooch, where a character named Stan Thompson is mentioned as being a person Lois had a relationship with, and the implication is left hanging that Meg might be his daughter rather than Peter's. The show does this as a quick gag. It doesn't commit to it, but it also doesn't walk it back, which is pretty much how Family Guy handles every potentially serious piece of character information. Drop it as a joke, leave it in the air, let the fans decide what to do with it. Over the years, there have been other moments where Meg's paternity has been used as a running joke. Peter makes comments that suggest, in a roundabout way, that he's not fully convinced she's his. Lois never engages with this directly. Meg herself has occasionally expressed the sense that she doesn't fit in the family, which the show plays as teenage angst, but which could, under this theory, be something closer to instinctive knowledge. The appeal of the Stan Thompson version of Meg's paternity is that it would explain, or at least contextualize, the way Peter treats her. If Meg isn't Peter's biological daughter, and if Peter has some level of subconscious awareness of that, then his inability to connect with her starts to read less like cruelty and more like a biological discomfort he can't name. He's not rejecting his daughter. He's rejecting a stepdaughter he doesn't know he's a stepfather to, which is, I want to say, still not great behaviour, but it's behaviour that makes a different kind of sense than just being cruel for no reason. Chris is where the theory starts to get speculative in a way that's harder to defend. U/Matilda Lover 128 proposed that Chris is biologically the son of Dr. Hartman, the family's longtime physician. The argument is, honestly, a bit thin. It's based on a few moments across the show where Chris demonstrates unexpected competence, which could theoretically be interpreted as medical intuition inherited from a doctor father. The more grounded evidence is just that Lois is around Dr. Hartman a lot, and Dr. Hartman is, by Lois's standards of sexual openness on the show, probably more her type than Peter is. I don't find this one particularly persuasive, personally. Chris's occasional competence feels more like a writing inconsistency than a genetic clue. And Dr. Hartman, while he does have his moments, doesn't really have enough of a presence in the Griffin household to make the theory land. But the Reddit community seems to like it, so it's out there. Stewie, as I mentioned, is mostly disproven by canon. The theorists' argument was that Stewie is the son of a pornographic film actor from a movie Lois starred in once called The Quest for Fur. The actor apparently sounds and looks quite a bit like Stewie, in the way that cartoon characters who share a voice actor often resemble each other because they share a voice actor. This is, if nothing else, a testament to how deeply invested some fans get in this show. Someone went back through Family Guy's catalogue of gags and identified a one-off porn film character and built a theory around him. The counter-argument from canon is strong enough that I don't think the Stewie part of this theory holds up. Chap Stewie directly addresses his paternity in a way that confirms Peter fathered him. Bertram exists and is half Stewie, which means they share a father who is Peter. Multiple episodes treat Stewie's parentage as settled in Peter's favour. This one just doesn't survive contact with the text. The theory has a layer underneath the individual pieces that I think is worth sitting with. There's an episode called House of Peters, which establishes a recurring gag about Peter having donated to a sperm bank at some point in his past, and the various children of those donations all look identical to him. They've got the big chin, the glasses, the general Peter-ness. The show uses this for laughs, Look at all the little Peters. Isn't it funny? But the gag actually argues against the Matilda Lover 128 theory quite strongly. It establishes that Peter's genes are pretty dominant. If he fathered children with donated sperm, those children turn out looking like him. So if he'd fathered Meg and Chris and Stewie, you'd expect them to look like him. And if you look at the Griffin family, they kind of do, in their own ways. Chris has the body shape, Stewie has the chin, Meg is the outlier, physically, which is what gave the original theorists something to latch onto in the first place. So the theory is, technically, mostly wrong. Which raises the more interesting question, which is why it exists at all. I think the Peter isn't the father theories are really doing something slightly different from what they claim to be doing. On the surface, they're trying to explain Peter's behaviour toward his kids. Under the surface, I think they're a way for fans to express their frustration with Peter as a parent. The theory gives the show's worst parental moments an explanation that isn't just, this guy is bad at being a dad. It makes Peter's failures less damning by making them the failures of a man who, deep down, knows he's not fully connected to these kids. That's a slightly dishonest framing, if you poke at it. It's the fandom letting Peter off the hook by inventing a reason he can't fully love his kids, which ironically kind of proves that Peter is a bad dad. If you feel the need to invent biological explanations for why a father would treat his children the way Peter treats his, you've already conceded that the behaviour requires explaining, that the default position is no, this isn't how a functioning father acts. What Family Guy actually presents us with, if we take it at face value, is simpler and grimmer. Peter is the biological father of Meg, Chris and Stewie. He's just not a particularly good one. He neglects Meg because she's a convenient target. He doesn't know how to connect with Chris because Chris is a bit of a blank slate, and Peter doesn't have the patience to draw anything out of him. He doesn't connect with Stewie because Stewie is either an alien super genius or is plotting to murder his mother, depending on the episode. And either of those scenarios would challenge most parents. Peter isn't failing at fatherhood because of a secret genetic mismatch. He's failing at fatherhood because he's a man with, as we've established, a formal diagnosis of cognitive impairment, a drinking problem he inherited from his biological father, an emotionally abusive stepfather as his only parental model, and no idea how to relate to the children he actually has. But that's a heavy reading, and fans generally prefer lighter ones that give the characters more narrative interest. So the Peter isn't the dad theory persists, even though the evidence for it is shaky, because it's more interesting than the alternative explanation, which is just, he's a bad dad. There is one bit of the theory that I do find compelling, and it's not directly about the paternity question. The theorist argues that the reason Lois cheats on Peter, or at least is rumoured to have cheated on Peter in various episodes, is that Peter does stupid things specifically to irritate her, and she retaliates by sleeping with other people. That's a reading of the Griffin marriage that I think actually has some textual support. There are episodes where Lois's behaviour toward Peter makes more sense if you assume she's quietly furious with him in ways she's not allowed to express directly. And sleeping with other men is one of the ways that anger comes out. Whether any of those affairs actually produce children is a separate question, and one I'd argue the theory doesn't really answer. But the underlying read of the marriage, that it's a relationship with a lot of suppressed resentment on Lois's side, is worth sitting with. It casts Peter differently than the show usually wants to cast him, which is as a lovable goof. Under this reading, he's a lovable goof whose wife is running a slow, quiet campaign of retaliatory infidelity, and he has no idea it's happening. That's a lot more uncomfortable than the show wants its main character relationship to be. And it's probably part of why the theory persists, because sometimes the most compelling fan theories are the ones that say, what if the show is lying to us about what this relationship actually is? And the truth underneath the sitcom rhythms is much darker than the sitcom rhythms let on. Anyway, whatever you make of any of that, there's a related thread worth pulling on before we move off fatherhood entirely, which is the question of the children Peter has had who aren't in the main family, because he has had those, at least two that the show has explicitly told us about. And that sits alongside the paternity theory in a way that makes it slightly weirder than it already was. Peter Griffin has had more than 3 children. Most people who watch Family Guy casually probably don't know this. You'd assume Meg, Chris and Stewie are the complete set because they're the only ones who show up in the opening credits and the family dinner scenes. But the show has canonically established, in separate episodes and cutaways across its long run, that Peter has at least 2 other biological sons whose existence is permanent in the universe of the show, even if the show mostly declines to do anything with them. The first is Peter Griffin Jr. Peter Jr. is a character who exists entirely in passing references and brief cutaways. The short version of his story is that he was Peter and Lois's first child, born before Meg, who died in infancy because Peter shook him too much. That's it. That's the gag. The show mentions him in a handful of episodes, always as a throwaway reference, always for a cheap laugh, and then moves on like it hasn't just confirmed that the main character of the show is responsible for the death of his own infant son. This is genuinely one of the most extraordinary things Family Guy has ever established about Peter as a character, and the show has done almost nothing with it. It's canon. It happened. Peter has a dead baby in his past who he directly caused the death of, and the show treats this with roughly the same narrative weight as the giant chicken fight. And look, I get it. Family Guy isn't really trying to be the kind of show where that kind of backstory gets processed. It's not doing emotional continuity. The Peter Jr. reference is a joke that exists to be shocking and then to be forgotten. That's fine as comedy. But as fan theory material, it's extremely potent because it sits there in the canon as a piece of context that, if you applied it to almost any other character study of Peter, would completely change how you saw him. Think about what it means to read the mental institution theory with Peter Jr. added into the mix. Under that theory, Peter has lost Meg, Chris, Lois and Stewie and built an imaginary family to replace them. But if Peter Jr. is also part of his actual history, then Peter has already lost one child before the tragedy the institution theory is built around. And that first loss was his direct fault. That changes the shape of his grief in the imagined world. It's not just a sudden catastrophic loss, it's the final act of a man who's been losing children for most of his adult life. You can read the Meg hatred differently if you accept Peter Jr. as context. Peter Jr. died because Peter couldn't regulate his own behaviour around an infant. Peter projects a lot of responsibility onto Meg in the institution theory because Meg was the one driving in the accident that killed Chris. But Peter's own history as a father doesn't give him much standing to be angry about reckless behaviour that gets children killed. That was, in a very direct way, his own story first. Or, for that matter, read Peter Jr. through the cognitive impairment lens we talked about in section 3. A man with genuine cognitive impairment, who doesn't fully understand the consequences of physical force, and who is left to handle an infant, is a man who is set up for a tragedy to happen. The show treats it as an isolated dark joke, but the fan theory community has noticed that if you line up Peter's canonical impairment with the canonical death of Peter Jr., you get a picture that is, frankly, awful. So that's the first forgotten son. And then there's Bertram. Bertram is a much more fleshed out character than Peter Jr., because he's been a recurring antagonist on the show for years. The backstory on Bertram is that Peter, at some point in his past, donated sperm to a fertility clinic. This was done, if I'm remembering correctly, to earn the money for a video game. The show treats this with exactly the same gravity it treats most of Peter's decisions, which is to say, none. He needed money, he donated sperm, he got a Nintendo. End of story, as far as Peter is concerned. But the sperm was used. Peter's biological child was born to a different family. And that child, eventually, turned out to be Bertram, who, in a plot twist that Family Guy has actually engaged with fairly seriously, developed into Stewie's primary nemesis across multiple episodes. Stewie and Bertram have, over the years, had an elaborate rivalry that's played out across time travel adventures, war crime plotlines, and at least one attempt by Bertram to take over the world. They are, it's been confirmed, biological half-brothers. They share a father, who is Peter, and neither Peter nor Stewie ever really engages with the full emotional implication of this, because Family Guy doesn't do that kind of engagement. Bertram is just a recurring villain who also happens to be Stewie's half-brother, and the show asks you to hold both of those facts in your head simultaneously without drawing any particular conclusion from them. The fan theory community has drawn a lot of conclusions from it. Quite a lot, actually. Some of the wilder extensions include the idea that Bertram's existence proves Peter's DNA is scattered across Quahog in ways the show hasn't fully acknowledged. If he donated sperm once for a Nintendo, he might have done it again. There could be dozens of biological Peter children walking around Quahog, interacting with the main characters as friends and acquaintances, with nobody knowing they're technically Griffins. One Redditor I came across proposed that Cleveland Jr., the son of Peter's best friend Cleveland, might actually be one of Peter's biological children. The argument is mostly that Cleveland Jr. doesn't really look much like Cleveland, and the show has never established why. It's a stretch. It's a proper stretch. But it's the kind of stretch this show invites because the show itself has set up the conditions for this kind of speculation by establishing Bertram as canonically real without really processing what Bertram's existence means. Let me back up for a second and connect this to what we were talking about in the last section, because I think the connection is actually more important than any of the individual theories. The Peter isn't the dad theory and the Forgotten Sons canon are both doing the same thing, from opposite directions. The first theory says Peter is raising 3 kids who aren't biologically his. The canon says Peter has at least 2 biological children who aren't in the household. In both cases, the underlying question is the same, which is, what is Peter's actual relationship to fatherhood, and has it ever matched the one the show presents? The show presents Peter as a sitcom dad, dim but loving, makes mistakes but ultimately cares, a man who would, when push came to shove, show up for his kids. That's the default mode. But the show has also told us, across its run, that Peter has fathered a child who died in infancy because of him, has fathered at least one other child with a stranger for the price of a video game, and has mistreated the 3 children, actually in his household to an extent that has generated an entire subgenre of fan theories trying to explain why. That's not the profile of a sitcom dad. That's the profile of something much more unsettling, which the show has chosen to render as a sitcom because that's the genre it operates in. And this is, I think, part of why Family Guy generates the kind of fan theorizing it generates. Most sitcoms give you characters who behave in sitcom ways for sitcom reasons. Family Guy gives you characters who, if you take the canon at face value, have done deeply weird and often tragic things in their backstories, and then asks you to accept them as sitcom characters anyway. The gap between what the canon says and what the show does with it is wide enough to drive a lot of fan theory traffic into. The Forgotten Sons are one of the clearest examples of this gap. Peter Griffin Jr. is a dead infant in Peter's history. The show treats him as a punchline. Bertram is a biological son who has tried to kill the main family's favourite character multiple times. The show treats him as a villain of the week. Neither of these facts, as far as I can tell, has ever been processed by Peter himself on screen. He doesn't think about Peter Jr. He doesn't wrestle with his relationship to Bertram. He just carries on doing Peter Griffin things, in a world where his children include a dead baby and a toddler war criminal in a sailor suit. If you wanted to argue that Peter has some kind of dissociative relationship to fatherhood, this is the canonical evidence for it. He has had more children than he engages with. He has caused the death of one of them. He has produced another via means he barely remembers. And he has, across all of this, maintained the same basic effect, which is a cheerful inability to take any of it seriously. That's not really a theory, to be fair. That's just what the show actually says about the character if you line up the canon in order. But I wanted to sit with it for a bit, because it's the background against which most of the other Peter Griffin theories are operating. When fans argue that Peter is in a mental institution, or that Peter has a hive mind, or that Peter isn't really the father of his kids, they're working against a canonical backdrop in which Peter's relationship to fatherhood is already quite a lot stranger and darker than the show presents on a week-by-week basis. The Forgotten Sons aren't themselves the source of a big, famous fan theory. They're the footnote that a lot of other fan theories are built on top of, whether the theorists know it or not. And I think they're worth naming directly before we go on, because they cast everything we've talked about so far in a slightly different light. Peter is not just a sitcom dad with issues. Peter is a man whose full canonical history, once you line it up, is much weirder than the show's weekly tone suggests. Anyway, keeping the canonical weirdness thread going, there's a whole separate ecosystem of Peter Griffin contradictions that have to do with his own origin story rather than his children's, his own past, his own parents, his own birthplace, his own nationality. And that's a bit of a rabbit hole in its own right, so we should probably give it its own section before we move on to anything else. Let's just work through what Family Guy has, over the years, told us about where Peter Griffin actually comes from. Because each individual piece is weird, and the pieces together are, to put it mildly, not consistent. Start with what we were given early on. Peter was presented as the son of Francis Griffin, a devoutly Catholic Irish-American who was a bit of a piece of work. Francis doesn't really appear that often in the first few seasons, but when he does, he's hostile toward Peter in a way the show plays for comedy. He disapproves of Peter's weight, his career choices, his wife, his parenting, basically everything about him. Peter is presented as a man who grew up with his father's disapproval as the background noise of his entire childhood. This holds for a while. Through the first 4 seasons or so, Francis is just Peter's dad, and their relationship is what it is. Then, in season 5, in an episode called Peter's Two Dads, the show completely retcons Peter's origins. Francis dies in an unfortunate unicycle incident involving Peter being drunk at Meg's birthday party. His last words to Peter are, and I'm not making this up, "You're a fat, stinking drunk," which is, as a send-off from a father to his son, extraordinarily mean, even by Family Guy standards. After Francis's death, Peter goes through some hypnotherapy and uncovers a memory of Francis telling him at some point that he wasn't his real father. Peter confronts Thelma, his mother, about this, and she confirms it. She had an affair with an Irishman about 40 years prior, while she was on holiday in Ireland. That affair produced Peter. Francis raised him anyway, but the man Peter thought was his father was never his biological father. So Peter and Brian fly to Ireland and eventually track down a man named Mickey McFinnigan in a fictional Irish village called McSwiggan. Mickey is the town drunk, not the town drunk as a colourful figure of speech, the actual, formal, widely acknowledged town drunk. Peter challenges him to a drinking contest, wins, and in winning is accepted by Mickey as his son. This is how the show resolves the paternity question, by a literal drinking contest, which, fine. That's where we are in season 5. Peter is half Irish, the son of a functional alcoholic named Mickey, and the stepson of a man named Francis, who died despising him. Then in season 6, another piece drops. In Padre de Familia, Peter becomes very enthusiastic about being American after a Veterans Day celebration. He decides he wants to prove his citizenship properly. He goes to his mother's house to find his birth certificate. And Thelma, who has been sitting on this information for about 40-some years, tells him that he wasn't born in America at all. He was born in Mexico. The full story is that Thelma, when she found out she was pregnant by the Irish drunk, decided she was going to end the pregnancy and travelled to Mexico to do so. When she got there, she changed her mind. She gave birth to Peter in Mexico. She then brought him back to the United States as an infant, without any immigration paperwork, because she didn't want to have to explain what she'd been doing in Mexico. Peter, as far as American law is concerned, has been an undocumented immigrant for his entire life without knowing it. His marriage to Lois, which has lasted decades, is technically not legally valid under American law because he was never a legal American citizen when it took place. That's 2 huge origin retcons in the space of about 1 season. Peter's father isn't who he thought it was. Peter wasn't born where he thought he was. His entire identity, as he'd constructed it up to that point, is wrong in 2 of its most foundational particulars. And these aren't the only retcons. Earlier in the show's run, Season 3 had an episode called Peter Griffin, Husband, Father, Brother, in which Peter discovered he had a black ancestor named Nate Griffin, who had been owned as a slave by the Pewterschmidt family, Lois's family. Peter spends the episode trying to extract reparations from Carter Pewterschmidt for this ancestral injustice, squanders the money, and eventually comes to terms with his heritage. So now we've also got a black ancestor in the mix. Peter is not just half Irish and Mexican born. He also has a black ancestor whose history is tangled up with his wife's family in a way that is, frankly, slightly distressing once you stop laughing at it. And then there are the smaller bits and pieces scattered across the show. Various episodes have thrown in different backgrounds for Peter, different childhoods, different family members, without ever really worrying about whether they contradict each other. His childhood has been shown a handful of different ways. His parents' relationship has been framed differently, across episodes. The only consistent thread is that the thread keeps changing. So, if you're a fan trying to make sense of this, you've got a few options. Option 1 is the multiverse reading, which we talked about in section 4. Each contradictory origin story is actually canon, just not all in the same universe. The Peter who's half Irish, and the Peter who's Mexican-born, and the Peter with the black ancestor are technically all real Peters, just in slightly different Griffin households that the hive mind consciousness is all experiencing. This is a clean fix for the contradictions, but requires you to accept a lot of cosmological baggage that the show doesn't usually engage with. Option 2 is the lying to himself reading, which works nicely with the mental institution theory. If Peter is in an institution constructing an internal reality, then his origin story would naturally shift around over the years, because he's not drawing on actual memories. He's drawing on bits and pieces of things he's absorbed, things that feel true, things that would make a good story. He'd have an Irish origin because that feels romantic and would connect him to the kind of heritage that American blokes like to claim. He'd have a Mexican birth because it would give his life a bit of drama. He'd have a black ancestor because it would give him something to wrestle with. These aren't memories. They're aesthetic choices made by a man whose grip on what actually happened to him is gone. Option 3, and this is the one that interests me most, is the confabulation reading. Confabulation is a real thing in neurology. It's a symptom that shows up in certain kinds of brain damage and in certain kinds of memory disorders. What it is, basically, is the brain making up memories to fill in gaps, and then believing the made-up memories are real. It's not lying. The person experiencing confabulation isn't trying to deceive anyone. They genuinely believe the false memories are accurate. Their brain has invented them and filed them as facts, and there's no internal signal telling the person these particular memories aren't reliable. People with confabulation can tell you in detail about things they did last week that they didn't actually do. They can describe relatives they don't have, holidays they never went on, conversations that never happened, and they believe all of it. If you contradict them, they get confused because the memory feels real. The neurology doesn't flag it as manufactured. Peter Griffin, with his canonical cognitive impairment and his possibly heritable neurological issues from Mickey McFinnigan's side of the family, is basically a walking case study for confabulation. The origin story shifts could, under this reading, be not lies and not multiverse artifacts, but genuine memory disorder. Peter's remembering the most recent version of his past as the real one every time the writers come up with a new version. because his brain doesn't have the capacity to notice that the previous version contradicts this one. Each new origin feels to him like it was always true. The previous origin is either forgotten or quietly revised to accommodate the new one. That's, I think, the most interesting reading of the Peter contradictions. It doesn't require the multiverse. It doesn't require a mental institution. It just requires you to accept, again, that Peter is neurologically impaired in ways the show has acknowledged and then refused to take seriously, and that his memory of his own life doesn't work the way most people's memories work. Now, the other player in all of this is Thelma, Peter's mother, and she deserves a bit of attention here because she's the source of most of the foundational lies in Peter's life. She's the one who kept the Mickey McFinnigan secret. She's the one who gave birth in Mexico and never told her son about it. She's the one who let Francis raise Peter, knowing Francis wasn't his real father. She's been sitting on 3 or 4 major pieces of information about Peter's identity for decades, and she released them in dribs and drabs across different episodes, usually for comedic effect, usually in a way that rearranged Peter's understanding of himself. She's a character the show has never really treated with the seriousness she probably warrants. Thelma died in season 12 of a fatal stroke in an episode called Mom's the Word. Her death is played with some genuine emotional weight for one episode, and then the show moves on. But she takes to her grave, as far as I can tell, the full story of who Peter actually is. We got bits and pieces from her across the years. We never got the full picture. She never sat Peter down and told him everything. She never apologized for any of it. She died, and whatever she knew about her son that she never told him, she took with her. Under any of the theories we've talked about, that's a significant loss for the character. If Peter is in an institution, Thelma's death means he'll never learn the real version of his real life. If Peter has cognitive impairment and memory problems, Thelma's death means he's lost his last reliable source of information about his own past. If Peter is a hive mind consciousness, well, Thelma's death means something different in every dimension, but it's probably still sad somewhere. A man who has never known a single fixed fact about his own origin, whose mother kept him in the dark on purpose for most of his life, whose biological father is a stranger who accepted him only after a drinking contest, whose legal father hated him, whose nationality is technically not what he thought it was, and whose ancestry apparently includes a black man owned by his wife's family as a slave. That's a lot to carry, and most people would, I think, struggle to carry it cleanly. Peter, to his credit or to his complete obliviousness, carries none of it. He doesn't seem to notice that any of this is heavy. He finds out something catastrophic about his own identity, deals with it for 22 minutes, and then forgets about it forever, which is either the most resilient thing anyone on television has ever done, or a deeply troubling symptom of his underlying neurological condition, depending on which reading you're going with. I lean toward the troubling symptom reading, personally, but then I've been thinking about Peter Griffin for too long, which is a sentence I never thought I'd say. Now. From Peter's mother and his origins, there's a natural move to the other parent in his life, Francis Griffin, the stepfather who raised him. Because the Francis relationship is, in some ways, the most directly, psychologically consequential thing in Peter's entire backstory. And there's a whole body of fan theory attached to what Francis actually did to Peter over the years, and how much of who Peter became is attributable to him. Worth unpacking. Francis Griffin is a character who doesn't get talked about much these days, partly because he died back in season 5 and partly because when he was alive the show mostly used him as a one-note comedic villain rather than a figure of any particular depth. But he's the single most important relationship in Peter's childhood, and a surprising amount of Peter Griffin fan theorizing traces back, directly or indirectly, to what Francis did. The basic facts about Francis are these. He was an Irish Catholic man of the older generation, rigid, unyielding, theologically devout, in the specific way that makes a family miserable rather than the way that makes a family close. He raised Peter, knowing Peter wasn't his biological son, and resented him for it across the entire duration of that upbringing. He expressed the resentment openly. He was verbally abusive toward Peter consistently from early childhood onward. He disapproved of everything Peter did and every choice Peter made. He was not, to put it bluntly, a father figure in any useful sense of the word. He was a sustained negative pressure on a child. And the show, to its credit, doesn't really soften this. When Francis appears in episodes, he's mean to Peter. Not playful sitcom dad mean, actually mean in a way that lands. He criticises Peter's weight, his intelligence, his wife, his children, his career. He expresses disappointment as a default setting. On the rare occasions he tries to engage with Peter's family, he does it in a way that's corrosive. There's an episode where he insists on having Stewie baptised Catholic against Lois's wishes and ends up forcibly submerging the baby in tainted holy water, nearly causing Stewie serious harm. The show plays this for jokes, but the underlying fact is that Francis, given access to his grandson, injured him in service of a religious ritual nobody else in the family wanted performed. His death, in an episode called Peter's Two Dads, is the moment a lot of Peter's backstory finally gets aired out. Peter, drunk at Meg's 17th birthday party, crashes into Francis while attempting to ride a unicycle down the stairs. Francis is taken to hospital. His last words to his son, as I mentioned earlier, are, "You're a fat, stinking drunk." That's what Francis had to say, at the end, when he knew it was the end. Those were the words he chose to leave Peter with. And this is the context that a lot of the more psychologically serious Peter Griffin fan theories operate inside. The theory, which you can find in various forms across Reddit and YouTube video essays, is that Peter's entire adult personality is a coping mechanism he built as a child to survive Francis's contempt. Everything people find charming or annoying or tragic about Peter Griffin as a character can be traced back, if you follow the thread, to a kid learning very early that being himself was unacceptable to his father and building a whole alternative self to inhabit instead. Let me explain what I mean by that. A child who grows up with a parent who constantly expresses disappointment has a few options, broadly speaking. They can try to perform well enough to win approval. They can rebel and stop trying. Or they can become the thing the parent is disappointed in, lean into it, and make it their identity, so that the disappointment stops being a wound and becomes just the weather. Peter, under this theory, took the third option. Francis wanted him to be smart, serious, devout, disciplined. Peter gave up on being any of those things and leaned hard into being the opposite. Loud, lazy, dumb, hedonistic, irreverent. If he couldn't be what his father wanted, he could at least be definitively not that, which has its own kind of stability. The problem with this strategy, obviously, is that if you perform dumbness for long enough, starting early enough, you stop being able to distinguish between performance and reality. The neural pathways you don't use don't develop. The skills you don't practice don't build. A 10-year-old who chooses to act stupid because acting stupid is safer than trying and failing to be smart is a 30-year-old who literally cannot do the things he pretended he couldn't do as a child. The bluff has become the hand. This connects back to the petarded plot in a way I find kind of moving. If you accept that Peter performed dumbness as a survival strategy against Francis, then the canonical diagnosis in petarded isn't really a natural condition. It's a developmental outcome. Peter wasn't born impaired. He became impaired, in effect, by refusing to exercise the cognitive muscles that would have gotten him into trouble with his father. The test result in petarded is the accurate measurement of a cognitive capacity that was allowed to atrophy over decades of deliberate underuse. That is, if you take it seriously, properly tragic. A child who could have been a regular adult became the version of an adult he performed for safety as a kid, and by the time he was old enough to realise he could stop performing, the damage was permanent. The performance had become him, and Thelma, as we talked about, wasn't really protecting him from any of this. She had her own reasons, presumably. She was the one who'd had the affair. She was the one who'd chosen to stay married to Francis and raise the resulting child inside a household where that child's origins were a source of constant, unspoken tension. She was, in her own way, complicit in what Francis did to Peter. Not by actively participating in it, but by declining to shield him from it. A mother who let her husband verbally abuse her son for decades while sitting on the secret that the son wasn't actually the husband's is a mother who made a choice, even if she never framed it as one. And when you line this up with the stuff we talked about in the last section about Peter's origins, the picture gets bleaker. Peter grew up being called worthless by a man who wasn't actually his father, while his mother knew the truth and said nothing, while his biological father was halfway across the world, drinking himself into oblivion in an Irish village. The foundational emotional reality of his childhood was a lie, and the adult relationships he was supposed to use to build his sense of self were, every one of them, unavailable to him in different ways. Francis was hostile. Thelma was absent. Mickey didn't know Peter existed. Lois came later and brought her own complications. There's a theory that extends this further, and I think it's worth mentioning even though it's harder to support from the text directly. It goes that Peter's alcoholism, which is the other clearly canonical fact about his adult life, isn't just Mickey McFinnigan's genetic inheritance coming through. It's Peter imitating his father. If the only model of masculinity he ever had was Francis, and Francis drank, then Peter drinking is Peter performing a version of manhood he was taught by the man who hated him. He's trying, in his own broken way, to be the kind of man Francis might have respected, by being the kind of man Francis was, which included being an alcoholic. It's, if you read it this way, the single most heartbreaking element of Peter's adult behaviour. He's still trying to win his dead stepfather's approval by mimicking his worst habits, decades after the stepfather stopped being able to give approval for anything. I don't know if that's true. It's the sort of theory that feels more true than it can really be proven. It's the kind of thing a fan writes in a Reddit comment at 2 a.m. after watching too many episodes. But it's a theory that, once you've heard it, is hard to unhear. Every time Peter reaches for a beer, under this reading, he's reaching for a gesture that was first taught to him by the man who spent Peter's entire childhood telling him he was worthless. There's also a quieter body of fan speculation about physical abuse, which I want to mention but not dwell on. The show has never directly shown Francis physically hitting Peter, though it has shown him being verbally brutal and emotionally withholding to a degree that most people would consider abusive on its own terms. Some fans have read between the lines and argued that the show is implying physical abuse without showing it, pointing to certain moments in Peter's flashbacks where the staging feels evasive, or to Peter's specific adult patterns of flinching or absorbing pain without reaction. It's speculative. I don't think the show confirms it, but the speculation exists, and it's worth acknowledging as part of the landscape of Peter Griffin fan theory, without pushing it any further than the evidence supports. What I think is more defensible, and what a lot of the mainstream Peter theory discourse actually agrees on, is that Peter's relationship with Francis is the foundational damage under all the other damage. The institution theory, where Peter has lost Meg and Chris and Lois, sits on top of a Peter who is already shaped for grief. The cognitive impairment theory, where Peter is neurologically below threshold, sits on top of a Peter whose mental development was shaped by survival mode underperformance. The origin story confusion sits on top of a Peter whose sense of self was destabilized from the very beginning by lies he didn't know were lies. All of the tragic readings of Peter Griffin lead back eventually to a small boy in a house with a man who hated him. The show rarely engages with this directly. It engages with it in flashes. There's an episode where Peter attempts to write a letter to the son Francis wanted him to be, and the letter turns into a weird meditation on not being good enough. There are cutaways where Peter's childhood appears, and the tone of those cutaways is noticeably different from the tone of most Family Guy cutaways. There's a flicker of something real in them if you look for it. But the show is a comedy, and the comedy mostly wins. Here's what I think the honest read of this section is, and I'll wrap up with it. Peter Griffin, under almost every theory we've talked about tonight, is a man who's been dealing with structural emotional damage since he was very small, and who has developed, across the decades of his life, a personality that works on the surface, but doesn't work underneath. The drinking, the clowning, the neglect of his kids, the inability to stay serious, the bouncing from job to job, the adventures that aren't really adventures so much as a series of distractions from having to think about anything for longer than about 90 seconds at a stretch. All of that is a man trying to get through the day, using tools he acquired as a child in a house where getting through the day was the whole job. You can hold him accountable for the damage he does to his own family, and fans absolutely do, but it's worth remembering at the same time that he came from somewhere. The damage didn't start with him. He inherited it, built it up, installed it in his own house, and passed some of it along. That's how generational stuff works. It's messy and it doesn't really stop, it just takes different shapes in different people. Which brings us sort of naturally to what Peter actually became as an adult. Because even if we accept that Francis made Peter what he is, there's still the question of what that actually looks like day to day. And there's a specific, slightly poetic fan reading of Peter's adult behaviour that I think deserves its own section. The one where Peter, in response to all of this, simply refused to grow up. Peter Griffin is 43 years old. He's been 43 years old for a very long time, obviously, because that's how time works in Family Guy. But assuming we're taking his stated age at face value for the purposes of this discussion, he's a man in middle age. Wife, 3 kids, mortgage, full-time job at the brewery, friends he's known for decades, routines that have solidified into habits. By every external marker, Peter Griffin is an adult. And yet, watch any episode of the show and consider what you're actually looking at. Peter has toys, a lot of toys. His house is full of them. He has ongoing, deeply felt rivalries with inanimate objects and fictional characters. He gets into actual physical altercations with a giant chicken over petty grievances, and the altercations last for entire commercial breaks and destroy half the town. And he treats each of them with the same seriousness a child treats a playground fight with someone who cheated at football. He reacts to adult news the way a 7-year-old reacts to adult news, which is to say, with a blank nod and a desire to change the subject as quickly as possible. He has never, as far as I can tell, sat through a single serious conversation about money or the future or his children's education without getting distracted halfway through by something irrelevant. He forgets birthdays. He doesn't remember what his own wife likes. He collects celebrity signatures. He becomes obsessed with individual songs for weeks at a time. He forms consuming emotional attachments to minor brands of soft drink. This isn't just the behaviour of a man who's a bit immature. This is the behaviour of a child wearing the body of a man, which the fan theory community has noticed and started trying to explain. The theory, which you can find in various forms on WatchMojo lists and Reddit threads and YouTube video essays, is that Peter has regressed. That at some point in his life, something happened that was traumatic enough to cause him to emotionally retreat to a childhood state, and that he has never really come back from it. He's lived the rest of his life in the body of an adult, while the person inside the body has stayed more or less about 10. Regression as a trauma response is a real thing. It's documented in the psychiatric literature. When people experience trauma that exceeds their ability to process it, one of the things that can happen, among many other things, is that they mentally relocate to a point in their life before the trauma. This can manifest in a lot of ways. Some people become more childlike in their coping. Some people revert to habits or interests they had as kids. Some people lose the ability to engage with adult responsibilities that remind them of what went wrong. It's not a permanent state, usually, and it's not the same for everyone, but it's a recognized phenomenon, and you see it most commonly in people who have been through something they weren't equipped to handle at the age they were when it happened. Peter fits this pattern almost uncomfortably well, if you accept the framing. The regression theory, in its most common version, connects directly to the mental institution theory we started with. Under the combined reading, Peter lost his family in the accident. The loss was catastrophic. His mind not only built the fantasy world we talked about in the first section, but also relocated him inside the fantasy to a version of himself from before his family existed. The Peter we're watching is a 10-year-old in Peter's body, because 10 is the last time Peter remembers being uncomplicatedly happy, before adolescence and marriage and parenthood introduced the possibility of losing anything that mattered. That's why he lives like a kid. He's trying to rewind his own consciousness to a point before he had anything to lose. Even if you don't buy the institution theory, though, the regression reading has its own standalone merit. We talked in the last section about how much damage Francis did to Peter during Peter's actual childhood. The version of childhood Peter got under Francis wasn't one he'd really want to return to, but childhoods are funny things. Even a bad childhood has moments in it that feel, compared to adult life, manageable. A kid who got shouted at by his dad at home might still have had great Saturdays. He might have had friends. He might have had a specific year when things were okay. And a man who grew up to carry a lot of adult damage might find himself quietly returning, in his off hours, to the specific parts of childhood that worked. Peter's obsessions, under this reading, are those parts. The 80s pop culture he can't stop referencing, the cartoons he watches religiously, the songs he can't forget, the specific brands of snack food he becomes consumed by, the giant chicken rivalry, which is, I think, the most literal expression of this. What child hasn't had a nemesis they elaborately imagined a grand battle with? The giant chicken is Peter's version of that, except he's an adult, and he has the capacity to act on it. And so the fantasy spills out into physical reality and destroys several city blocks every time. It's in its own way almost sweet if you squint at it. A lot of what Peter does makes more sense if you read it as a child's behaviour leaking into adult contexts. His relationship with his friends at the Drunken Clam has the feel of a middle school clique. Quagmire, Cleveland, Joe, and Peter sit at the same spots, have the same kinds of conversations, tell the same kinds of jokes, get into the same kinds of minor conflicts, week after week. That's not how adult friendships usually work. Adult friendships drift. They get tested by family demands and work pressures. They go dormant and come back. The Drunken Clam crew is locked in a kind of stasis that's more typical of kids who see each other every day at school, which they essentially do, in the sense that they show up at the same bar every night and pick up exactly where they left off. Peter's relationship with Stewie fits here too. Under any of the theories where Stewie is actually Stewie, Peter relates to him more like a peer than a son. He doesn't parent Stewie in any meaningful sense. He shares adventures with him. He plays with him. He lets him do whatever he wants and doesn't really worry about consequences. That's not how a functioning father relates to an infant. That's how a child relates to a younger child. An older kid allowed to babysit his little brother, who gets into mischief together rather than providing any sort of oversight. And his relationship with Brian similarly. Peter treats Brian like a childhood best friend who happens to live in his house. They have dumb adventures together. They play games. They have running jokes. Brian is, of course, a dog, which is its own layer of weirdness. But the dynamic between Peter and Brian is recognisably the dynamic of two kids who are inseparable. They're not colleagues. They're not housemates. They're little boys who've been in each other's lives forever and haven't figured out how to act any other way around each other. What I find compelling about the regression reading is that it's the most generous theory we've got for Peter. It doesn't require him to be evil or stupid or broken in some fundamental, permanent way. It just requires him to be stuck. A person who got hurt at a certain age and who, for reasons he doesn't understand, and probably isn't capable of understanding, hasn't been able to grow up past it. That's a recognizable human experience. A lot of people know someone who's a bit like this, who can't quite adult, who seems to have been permanently shaped by something they won't talk about, who occupies the body of a middle-aged person while clearly operating on older, younger software. The regression theory lets you feel something like sympathy for Peter without requiring you to buy into the full tragic architecture of the institution theory. It says, look, this guy's hurt. He's been hurt for a long time. He's doing the best he can with the tools he has. The tools are the tools of a 10-year-old because that's when his emotional growth stopped. The damage he does to other people is real, and it matters, but it's not coming from malice. It's coming from a place inside him that never got upgraded. I think that's actually how the show is mostly asking us to relate to Peter, even when it doesn't frame it in these terms. Family Guy doesn't want you to hate Peter. It wants you to find him funny and a bit annoying and occasionally lovable. The regression reading gives you a framework for doing that while still acknowledging that his behaviour is objectively a problem. You can laugh at the giant chicken fight and still, at the same time, feel a flicker of sadness for the man having it. Because under this theory, that fight is the most honest expression of who Peter actually is, which is a kid who never got to stop being a kid. One extension of this theory I came across, which I think is worth mentioning, is the idea that Peter's relationship with Meg is actually an expression of his regression rather than a contradiction of it. Under the institution theory, Meg gets treated badly because she was responsible for the accident. Under the regression theory, Meg gets treated badly because she represents adulthood. She's the oldest. She's the one who's nearly out of the house. She's the one whose presence most forcefully reminds Peter that time is passing and that children grow up, which is the thing his whole psychological architecture is organised around denying. If Peter has frozen his own internal age at 10, then having a teenage daughter is, at a subconscious level, unbearable to him. Meg being older than him, emotionally, is not a metaphor. In the way Peter's mind works, he actually is younger than his own daughter, and he resents her for it. Not because she did anything wrong, because she exists as a reminder that the clock keeps moving, whether Peter acknowledges it or not. That's a miserable little reading of the Peter and Meg dynamic, but it's internally consistent, and it connects a lot of dots without requiring the full grief fantasy apparatus of the institution theory. He's not angry at her for the accident. He's angry at her for growing up. She's done it, and he hasn't. And every time he looks at her, he's reminded of that fact. The other thing worth saying about the regression reading is that it actually predicts the show's signature device better than most other theories. The cutaway gag under this reading is the way a child's brain works. Kids don't hold topics. They jump around. They free associate. They see something that reminds them of something else, and they're off in a new direction before the last thing has resolved. If Peter's internal experience is that of a 10-year-old, then the show's cutaway structure isn't a quirky, stylistic choice. It's just what his stream of consciousness looks like from the inside. He's telling a story, he gets distracted by a memory of a TV show he loves. He goes on a 30-second tangent about it. He comes back, and whatever he was originally saying has receded. That's kid behaviour. That's exactly kid behaviour. Anyone who's tried to have a serious conversation with a 10-year-old has been through a version of this, where you ask them about their day, and 40 seconds later, you're somehow talking about a sandwich they had in year 3. The Family Guy cutaway is that experience stretched across an entire television series, and we've been watching it for longer than most sitcoms manage to stay on the air at all. All right, related to all of this, and honestly, a kind of natural follow-on from the regression stuff, is the question of the cutaways themselves. We've touched on them a few times over the course of this video, but they're probably worth a proper section of their own. because there's a specific fan theory about what they represent that ties most of what we've talked about tonight together into one final piece. Let's go there for the last stretch. The cutaway gag is Family Guy's defining piece of syntax. If you had to describe the show to someone who had never seen it, the cutaway is what you'd describe. A character will be in the middle of a conversation. They'll say something like, "This is worse than that time I was stuck in traffic." And then the show cuts to a 40-second, fully animated scene of the character stuck in traffic, with its own jokes, its own music, its own beginning, middle and end. And then the scene snaps back to the original conversation, and everyone carries on as if nothing happened. Critics have, over the years, been unkind to the cutaway. It's often cited as evidence that Family Guy is lazy writing, that it uses cutaways to skip over the hard work of actually building plots, that it's a crutch the show leans on when it doesn't have anything else to say. Seth MacFarlane himself has acknowledged in interviews that the cutaways are both the show's signature and its most common critical target. They are the thing people either love about Family Guy or use as a reason to never watch it. And look, most of the time, as a writing device, the cutaway is fine. It's a way to fit more jokes into an episode. It's a format that allows the show to hit its 90 jokes per episode target without having to have most of those jokes land in service of an actual plot. That's a mechanical explanation. It's probably, in terms of how the show actually functions as a production, the real explanation. But there's a fan theory, one that's been developing quietly in Reddit threads and video essays for a long time, that suggests the cutaway is doing something much more specific and much more psychologically revealing. The theory is that the cutaway gag isn't a writing choice at all. It's a symptom. And if you accept the theory, it connects everything we've talked about tonight into one final shape that's almost impossible to see around once you've noticed it. Under this reading, the cutaways are Peter Griffin's dissociation, rendered as a format. Let me unpack what that actually means, because it's a concept that's worth getting right. Dissociation, in the clinical sense, is a response to stress or trauma in which the mind partially disengages from present experience. It's a protective mechanism. When something is happening that the brain can't safely process, the brain produces a kind of temporary exit. Attention drifts, memory gets hazy, time feels strange. The person experiencing it isn't really there in the room anymore, or isn't fully there. Their consciousness has partially relocated to somewhere else, and when it comes back, the moment that triggered the dissociation has usually passed. In more severe forms, dissociation can produce quite specific phenomena: intrusive imagery, random memories that surface out of nowhere, bizarre free associations that don't logically connect to what was happening, a sensation of watching yourself from outside, a sense that the conversation you were having 20 seconds ago is unreachable because the thread has been lost and can't be picked back up. Now read those descriptions again and ask yourself how closely they match the experience of watching a Family Guy cutaway. A conversation is happening. Something is said that touches, however lightly, on an uncomfortable subject. A Griffin family dinner is about to become tense. Peter is being confronted with a failure of his. Lois is about to express a feeling. And then, exactly at that moment, the show produces a flash of unrelated imagery. 40 seconds of something else. An absurd scenario, a pop culture reference, a memory of something Peter saw on television in 1984. The original moment has passed. The show returns to the scene, and the thing that was about to be said isn't being said anymore. The conversation has moved on. That's dissociation. That's almost exactly how dissociation works in people who have it. And Family Guy, almost incidentally, seems to have built an entire narrative structure that replicates it. The theory has a couple of layers to it. The first layer is Peter's own dissociation. Peter, as we've established across this video, is a man with a lot of unprocessed material. He's got a fraught relationship with his father. He's got a fraught relationship with his mother. He's got canonical cognitive impairment. He's had at least one infant son die. He's possibly, depending on which theory you're holding, grieving a lost family he's replaced with a fantasy. Any of these contexts would produce a person who needed a lot of psychological defenses just to get through an ordinary afternoon. The cutaway, under this reading, is one of those defenses. Peter's mind genuinely does this. He genuinely can't stay in difficult conversations. His brain genuinely pulls him out of them into unrelated content. The second layer is that the show itself performs dissociation as a viewing experience. Family Guy, as a piece of television, doesn't just have cutaways. It is cutaways. It's organised around them. The main storyline is often more of a connective tissue between cutaways than a story in its own right. The show teaches its viewers to consume it in short bursts, to never settle into an emotional beat, to always be ready to jump. And that's, if you're in the right frame of mind, a slightly uncomfortable thing to notice about a show you've been watching for years. You've been training yourself, in a small way, to dissociate along with Peter. You've been accepting that sitting with anything is uncomfortable, and that the relief of a cutaway is preferable to the resolution of a scene. That's, I think, why Family Guy feels different at 1 in the morning than it does at 7 in the evening. In the evening, the cutaways feel like jokes. At 1 in the morning, when you're half awake and the ad breaks are hitting different, the cutaways start to feel like the actual content of the show, and the main plot starts to feel like filler between them, which is the reverse of how most television works, and it produces a very specific, very Family Guy kind of restlessness, which I think a lot of long-term viewers would recognise if you asked them to describe what it feels like to watch a few episodes in a row late at night. The third layer, and this is the one that I think is the most interesting, is that the cutaway isn't just Peter's dissociation. It's how the entire Griffin family survives being in the same house as Peter. Nobody in Quahog can sit with anything for long because Peter's proximity doesn't permit it. If Lois tries to have a real conversation with Peter, it ends in a cutaway. If Meg tries to get her father to engage with her, it ends in a cutaway. If Brian tries to deliver a difficult truth, it ends in a cutaway. The whole emotional weather of the Griffin household is organised around the fact that nobody can hold a thread of real feeling for more than about 45 seconds before something interrupts. Under this reading, the show isn't just about a dysfunctional family. It's about a dysfunctional family that has learned to accommodate the dysfunction by adopting the dysfunctional person's coping mechanism as the house default. Everyone else has started doing it too. They don't even notice they're doing it. The cutaways aren't just Peter's. They belong to Lois and the kids and Brian and the friends at the Drunken Clam. Everyone has given up on sustained emotional engagement because sustained emotional engagement with Peter in the room doesn't work, and so they've all agreed, implicitly, not to try. That's, I think, the deepest version of the dissociation reading. The cutaways aren't just a symptom of Peter's damage. They're the collective adaptation of everyone around him. They are the shape of what a family looks like when one of its members can't be reached, and the rest of them have decided to meet him where he is rather than demand that he meet them where they are. It's honestly one of the sadder things you can notice about Family Guy once you've started looking for it. The show has been on for so long that we've all, as viewers, stopped noticing how strange the cutaways actually are. We've learned to read them as jokes. We've accepted them as the native language of the show. But if you actually sit with what they structurally represent in every scene they appear in, they're the show telling you that something difficult is about to happen and then refusing to let it happen. Over and over. For a quarter of a century, if you watch Family Guy looking for the dissociation pattern, you start to see it everywhere. The cutaways don't just happen randomly, they cluster. They tend to show up at specific points, moments where Peter is being confronted, moments where the family is close to an honest exchange, moments where a conversation is about to land a real emotional beat. The cutaway arrives, the beat is avoided, and the show moves on. Once or twice an episode, dozens of times per season, thousands of times across the run. I want to be careful here not to overread this. Family Guy is not a prestige drama. It's not they're trying to be funny, but sometimes a comedic device used consistently enough for long enough in a specific kind of context accidentally produces something that looks a lot like psychological realism anyway. The cutaway gag, originally a joke mechanism, has ended up, across the long run of the show, rendering a remarkably accurate portrait of how dissociation functions in a real family. Not because the show meant to, because the show used the device so many times in so many different emotional contexts that the device accumulated meanings the writers never really intended for it. That's, I think, part of why Family Guy generates the kind of fan theorizing it does. The show has produced, sort of accidentally, a formal portrait of psychological damage, rendered in the specific syntax of cartoon comedy. Fans have noticed this. Fans have spent years trying to articulate what they're looking at. The cutaway as dissociation reading is one of the closer attempts at naming it, I think, though it's not the only one. Which is sort of the point, really. Every theory we've talked about tonight is doing a slightly different version of the same thing. The mental institution one, the heightened reality one, the cognitive impairment reading, the multiverse hive mind, the paternity theories, the forgotten sons, the origin contradictions, the Francis stuff, the regression reading. Different fans, different years, different frames, all wandering around the same character, trying to figure out why he feels the way he does. None of them are complete on their own. The cutaway reading doesn't close the question, it just adds another angle to it. Maybe what's going on inside Peter's head is the cutaways themselves. Maybe it's a grief fantasy, maybe it's nothing much, and he's just a cartoon who's been on for a long time. I don't know. I'm not sure anyone does, that's probably okay. So, that's where we're going to leave it for tonight. 10 theories more or less, plus all the little side threads that attach themselves along the way. Some of them contradict each other. Most of them probably aren't true in any strict sense, if truth is even a thing you can apply to a cartoon character. But they're all, in their own ways, trying to make sense of the same man. Which is funny when you put it like that, because the man isn't actually a man. He's a drawing. He's a drawing voiced by Seth MacFarlane. He's a drawing voiced by Seth MacFarlane on a show that started airing after the Super Bowl in 1999 and has, against all rational expectations, never really stopped. I don't think you need to land on a favourite tonight. I wouldn't, honestly. I've been thinking about all of these for weeks while putting this together, and I still couldn't tell you which one I'd pick as the correct reading. The multiverse one I like because it's fun. The regression one I like because it's kind. The institution one I respect because it's the most influential, even if I find it a bit heavy. The cutaway one I think is probably the most actually accurate, in the sense that it describes what the show is doing, rather than trying to invent a backstory for why the show is doing it. They all have their merits, they all fall apart if you poke at them hard enough. That's sort of the nature of fan theories generally. What I do think, having spent this much time with it, is that Peter Griffin is a stranger character than he looks from the outside. That's the thing that fascinates me about this whole enterprise, to be honest. You watch Family Guy casually, and Peter is a dim, loud man who falls down a lot. You watch Family Guy carefully, across enough episodes, and you end up with a figure who has canonical cognitive impairment, a dead infant son, a biological Irish father who is literally the town drunk of a fictional village, a Mexican birthplace, a black ancestor, a stepfather who died hating him, a mother who lied to him about nearly everything, and 3 children who may or may not be his depending on which fan is telling you the story. That's a lot of texture for a man designed primarily to shout at a chicken, and I think that's maybe the real takeaway, if there has to be one. Not any specific theory, just the quiet observation that if you pay enough attention to any piece of television for long enough, it starts to accumulate more weight than it was built to carry. That's not a Family Guy thing, that's a culture thing. Any show on air long enough will eventually be read into by people who have more time to think about it than the writers ever had to write it. The writers are just trying to hit a deadline. The fans have the rest of their lives. Most of the theories we talked about tonight were written by people who, at some point, were lying awake at some unreasonable hour, wondering why Peter Griffin hates his daughter, or why the show contradicts itself about who his dad is, or why cutaways work the way they do. Those people typed out their answers and posted them to Reddit and moved on with their evenings. And then other people read the posts and added their own layers and sent them to other people, and eventually the posts made it to TikTok. And eventually they made it to me. And now they've made it to you, via a channel that exists specifically to talk about things like this in the small hours. That's sort of a sweet chain of events when you think about it. A lot of strangers, separated by years, trying to make sense of a cartoon together without ever having met. I might do Stewie next, actually, if that's something that would interest anyone who's still awake, or Brian, or the wider Quahog lore. There's a lot more to pull on with this show than just Peter, and some of it is probably darker than anything we talked about tonight. No promises, but it's on the list. For now, though, if you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. That's a long stretch of someone's evening to give up for a ramble about a cartoon. I hope some of it was interesting. I hope more of it was sleepy, because that's really what we were going for. If you're still awake, have some water, maybe stretch a bit, and try not to think too hard about whether the man falling downstairs on Fox every Sunday night is secretly the sole conscious inhabitant of a multiverse-wide hive mind. That way, madness lies. Quahog is still out there, wherever Quahog is. Peter is still in it. Lois is still putting up with him. Meg is still getting the short end of things. Stewie is still plotting something that won't come to anything. Brian is still drinking at the bar, writing something that won't get published. Chris is still Chris. And somewhere on some channel in the background of some room in the world, the theme song is playing, and none of it is going to stop tonight, or tomorrow, or probably any time in the foreseeable future. Which, depending on how you look at it, is either the saddest thing about Family Guy or the most comforting. Sleep well if you're sleeping. See you next time.